Good evening, everybody. We will get started in just a minute. Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Robert Marshall. I am the Fire Marshal for San Mateo Consolidated Fire Department, and welcome to our Wildland Fire Preparedness Town Hall this evening. I have several people here with me, and we'll introduce them. Chief Towns, Deputy Chief Mike Towns, is running the slideshow for me tonight. So you will hear me occasionally say, advance to the next slide or something to that effect, and that's who I'm talking to. So thank you, Chief Towns. We'd like to welcome you to the Town Hall, particularly in the time of COVID. We know that it's not necessarily easy and that people are on Zoom meetings and other kinds of teleconferences all day. So we truly appreciate you coming and supporting us tonight, and hopefully you'll take some things away and you'll learn a few things. So that is one of our big goals for this evening. We are recording this presentation. It will eventually be available on our website. So if you know somebody who might be interested in the content and wasn't able to join us this evening, you can refer them to the website and they will be able to watch the video later on. Please advance to the next slide. A couple of housekeeping items. Attendees don't have the ability to speak. So if you would like to ask a question or make a comment, if you look in your bar along the top, there's a Q&A. If you click on that Q&A, you can enter in your question. We will be answering all the questions at the end of the presentation, and there's several of us here who can answer the questions depending on what your question exactly is. So feel free to ask a question at any time. We just won't be answering it until the end of the presentation. Next slide. So our panelists this evening are Fire Chief Ray Iverson, who you will hear from in just a minute, Deputy Fire Chief Kent Thrasher, who will talk towards the end of the presentation. I already mentioned Chief Mike Towns. Deputy Chief Towns is running the slideshow, and he's one of the moderators for this evening. Right below him, you'll see Janelle Masterson. She is our OES coordinator for San Mateo Consolidated Fire. and then myself, Robert Marshall. I'll be doing the bulk of the presentation, so you'll get to hear my voice throughout. So I'd like to turn it over to Chief Iverson for him to say a few words.
Thank you, Fire Marshal Marshall. I'd like to welcome everyone to our first virtual town hall meeting. On behalf of San Mateo Consolidated and our Fire Board of Directors, welcome to this presentation. We have a lot of things to cover and a lot of information to share. Our Fire Marshal, Robert Marshall, will be speaking to you, giving you helpful information, helping you and your families to be prepared and stay safe during our fire season that's upcoming. And actually, we are underway, well underway at our fire season as we speak. So I'd like to turn this over to Fire Marshal Marshall, and hope you have a wonderful, well-informed activity during this meeting.
Thank you, Chief. So wildland preparedness during a pandemic is probably a little different than any of us have ever experienced before. The thing is that while we face a perilous fire season, and especially in light of coronavirus with the threat it poses to firefighters, the fact of the matter is that the threat of wildfire hasn't diminished. Rain this season is not what we had hoped. San Francisco International Airport reports 45% of their normal rainfall for a year. San Jose is at 50% of normal for their rainfall for the year. So, and that's pretty much true all around the Bay Area. Warm temperatures are already upon us, and more is on the way. Next slide, please. So there are some response and approach differences under COVID. The statewide approach has changed. In the past, one of the things that we've tried to do is to let some fires burn and let it burn out some of the undergrowth if it wasn't threatening structures, and try and clear out some of that to help reduce the long-term fire danger. This year, that's not going to be the case. There's going to be a really aggressive effort to put out fires very early on. One of the challenges, though, with that is that that only works when we don't have high wind events. If we have a high wind event similar to what we saw in Redding or Paradise or Santa Rosa, those fires are growing very, very quickly at a very rapid pace, and there's nothing that we're going to be able to do to stop that. And so we're hoping that the weather will cooperate, but as we've seen in years past, that hasn't always been the case. Mutual aid is the process by which we actually provide help to one another. If somebody has a fire in Paradise, for example, San Mateo Consolidated and other fire departments throughout the county will send firefighters to them along with apparatus to help them. Because of COVID, we may not have as many crews available to respond, particularly to federal and state incidents. Fire camps may be bigger. We may have to travel farther. You may see what we would normally send 5 engines and a chief officer vehicle. You might see more engines going with fewer numbers of people on it just to try and quell the ability for the virus to spread in case somebody has them. We oftentimes rely on hotels and restaurants, and if we continue with the social distancing, that may be affected. So the way that we respond may change. There's also a very large concern about a second wave of infections, particularly as we start to reach the fall. That could become more and more prevalent. And fire season in California, particularly Northern California, tends to be a little worse when we reach the fall months, when we start getting into October, November. So we definitely have some concerns there. Next slide. Locally, we are concerned about budget impacts. We still don't really know what the budget impact is going to be overall, but some areas of the county may have significant impacts. We may have reductions of available resources, either through budgeting or because of the second wave of illness. We may have to reduce staffing if there's a second wave of illness, if we get a station that a bunch of people get infected or they get exposed, we may have to reduce the staffing. That also will play into what mutual aid resources are available to us. And so we're watching all of these things very, very closely. they are definitely a concern, and we want to make sure that we can do the most good when people most need it. Next slide. So in our approach, we've done some things exactly the same. We have a risk assessment that we've done that I'll talk about in a little bit. The state continues to work on their assessment. We have some software that we've been working with, one to help us with compliance and another one that will help us with evacuations. And I'll show those to you. I'll show you some screenshots from a couple of those here a little bit later on. Some things, though, have slowed, even though they didn't change. In the very beginning of the COVID crisis, landscapers were affected. There was a lot of confusion over whether or not they were essential employees and what they could do. If they came and they did fire mitigation, that was one thing. But then if they were cutting the lawn along with doing fire mitigation, there was a concern there and people weren't sure whether or not that was legal or not. So I think we've got all of that worked out now that we're approaching phase 2 of reopening. But we had some late rains, and anybody who's tried to cut wet grass knows that that doesn't work very well. So even though we are allowed unconditionally with our vegetation management stuff, it's still, because of the late rains, that hampered our ability and people's ability to get stuff done. We were working on a fire code ordinance that would have required when you cut your weeds, how you cut your weeds, if you were going to construct a building in a high vegetation area that had a high fire incidence, or a high fire risk rather, we would dictate basically how those things would occur. And I'll talk a little bit about some of those things a little bit later. But that had to slow, because when you do an ordinance, you want to make sure that people have as much ability to talk about the ordinance and understand it and give their feedback on it as possible. And because of the shelter-in-place orders, we weren't exactly sure how that was going to work, and we wanted to make sure that people had the best abilities to be able to talk about what the changes were going to be, so that they could weigh in on them and we could take that into consideration. So we are still working on the ordinance, and we will be rolling that out and doing some education about it and getting people's feedback on it. And people will certainly be able to comment at a public meeting about that ordinance once we do move down that road. So stay tuned, and we will involve everybody in that through our normal channels. There was also a lot of uncertainty about public education. We weren't sure how we could educate people once we had the ordinance out. And so that definitely has slowed a bit. I think we're getting a better handle on that. And tonight's presentation is actually an example of how we think we might be able to do that. So we have 4 phases that we have been using all along. The first phase was the risk assessment. The risk assessment basically tells us how much danger is there really when it comes to wildland fires. So we hired a company to come in, and they generated some maps for us based on the vegetation types that we have. We've gone through those maps quite a bit, and we think that we've got a good product, and we will be rolling those out. And that's part of the public education campaign once we get into that. One of the kind of side things that's going on with that, though, is the state is working on their maps as well. And they are supposed to be released soon, but there again, COVID has kind of slowed that down a little bit. So we're hoping that they will release those soon. One of the things that we want to make sure is that they don't diverge too much from what our risk assessment shows, because that has the potential of causing some problems. So we are keeping an eye on that, and we will release those maps as soon as we can. I'll show you a little bit about what that looks like a little bit later. Again, the second phase is grants as well as the ordinance that I already talked about. So we will have the ordinance forthcoming, and we'll get plenty of public input from that. The grant funding is something that we are actively working on. In fact, today, Janelle Masterson submitted a grant on our behalf to try and help with the public education piece. That public education piece will go towards educating people about phase 3, actually, and the FireWise community program, as well as the general fire risk throughout the jurisdiction. FireWise is a community program that is put on by the National Fire Protection Association with our help. And what it is it is a community-based program to help the community determine what it is that they would like to see and make their own community a much safer place to live. If you get an entire community involved, it's much better than if we continue down the road of just going down individual needs and individual approaches. So that's one of the big things that we are hoping to get. There are going to be other grant opportunities. We're hoping in the fall, usually there are grants that pop up for vegetation reduction projects and fuel management projects. So we're going to be watching for those and partnering with our cities to make sure that we are available for those grants and that we can hopefully do that and get some of the fuel reduction taken care of. The other portions of education, as I already mentioned, we need to make sure that people understand what the risk is. We need to understand how we can reduce those risks and how people can become better informed citizens about what happens during an event if there's a fire, and how we approach that from our side, but how you need to approach it from your side. We talk sometimes in terms of ready, set, go. And that's one of the things that we would do as well during our education phase. We would also be educating people on what it is that we would be looking for once it comes time to actually enforce the ordinance. Once we do that, then we can begin the enforcement. The enforcement, and I don't really like the term enforcement, even though that's what it is, but enforcement basically is the process of us going and identifying properties that have not complied, and then we will take action to figure out how we can get them to comply. Most of the time people comply voluntarily, it's not a problem. But occasionally you have people who can't do something or just refuse to do something, and we need to take action to do that. And so the ordinance will address that, and that'll be part of the education once we actually release the ordinance. The last phase is the evaluation, and the evaluation will occur kind of in a couple different ways. The first way evaluation occurs is through the education process. We can gauge a lot by the audiences that we serve and the feedback that those audiences give us. And so we can sometimes even see that when we go out, we can see that people are actually taking the abatement very seriously, and they ask us questions, and they're hiring people to go do that stuff. So that's one way that we can evaluate. The long-term evaluation, however, is that in 8 to 10 years, we will have another risk assessment done, and we'll generate new maps and see if anything has changed. The hope is that we would absolutely have changed some of that, and I'm hopeful that we will be able to accomplish that. Next slide. So I've mentioned the ordinance a couple of times. So what will the ordinance actually do? So the ordinance will designate zones, and you'll see on the maps that, that we will adopt, you'll see what those zones actually kind of look like. You'll be able to look at a map and enter in your address and be able to see what kind of a zone you're in. Once you know what kind of a zone you're in, there will be landscaping standards that will be set out. This isn't really much of a thing where you can plant this or you can't plant that, although we certainly may have some plants that can't be planted. But one of the things that we want to make sure that we do is address what kinds of vegetation you can have closest to your home and what needs to be a little farther away from your home. What has to happen with trees, for example. One of the things that you'll hear a little bit later on is that we don't like trees to be around chimneys. And so that's one of the things that would be in the ordinance. A lot of the landscape standards are things that are actually pretty standard, and the state may actually, in some areas of the jurisdiction, may actually compel us to do certain kinds of abatement. Our ordinance will mirror whatever that is. We will address construction standards. So California has a very specialized chapter of the building code that deals explicitly with wildland fire prevention. They've had that for quite a while now, actually. It's called Chapter 7A is what we refer to it as. And the thing about Chapter 7A is through the fires in Santa Rosa, Redding, and Paradise, we had a lot of buildings that were constructed to that standard. And what we found was that the standard actually works pretty well. Not every building was saved because sometimes you just can't protect against that kind of wind. But the majority of structures that were built to that 7A standard actually survived the fire. This was so impressive to a lot of people that the International Code Council, who writes our model codes, our base codes that we use here in California, is looking at a lot of those standards to bring in worldwide so that we can protect more people throughout the world. So that's a very good thing. And the good news about that is that there are low-cost ways of doing that. So it actually doesn't even cost that much to protect your house. The last thing that the ordinance will do is set up the enforcement process. And what that means is that we'll say, what it is that you have to do, when it is that you have to do it, and what the penalties would be if people do not comply. We luckily have a really good rate of compliance in this jurisdiction for almost all of our fire code issues. So I'm hopeful that that will translate across to this process as well. Next slide, please. So I've mentioned that we have some software that will help us in kind of doing these things. The first one helps us to identify the risk, and that program is called No Harm. The second thing is helping us with preparation and enforcement. That is from a company named 3DI, and they have a product called Protect, and that will help us to enforce the ordinance. There is also an element, well, I'll cover that in a second when I show you that. And then the last thing is, if there's an event, and it actually doesn't matter what kind of an event, you need to know how to evacuate. And we've actually got some software countywide that will help with that called Zone Haven. And that is primarily for wildfires. I think that's the basic reason why we got it, but it has a nice side effect of it's good for any sort of evacuation of any size. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a couple minutes. So No Harm is the risk assessment that I mentioned. And it's a mapping program, and it shows us kind of what the risks might be in a given area. The state is working on a map as well, and that may affect some of the things that we have, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. But in any event, property owners will be able to see their relative risk. What you see here on the right side of the screen is an actual map from our jurisdiction. This is along the back side of Sugarloaf, down along San Juan Road. If you find your property on there, you'll be able to find your property or type in an address, and you'll be able to click on it, and it will show you what your risk description is. So in this particular case, the risk description is high, meaning that you've got a fairly high risk. When you look at that orange that's next to it, the orange and the yellow, those are areas that are not terribly populated. There aren't a lot of structures, if any, on that land, but those areas do have some wildland fire risk, and you would see that those are high as well. We're hoping that we're going to release this by August, and that you'll be able to see what your relative risk is in there, and it'll help you determine what it is that you need to do to kind of help fix up your property so that you are as safe as you can possibly be from wildfire. So once we've covered the risk, then we get to the preparation and enforcement. As I mentioned, 3DI software has a program called Prevent, and it assists in our ability to inspect a property. We see it in a couple of different ways. So the first thing, if you look to the far right of those pictures, you'll see a bunch of little blue boxes, and some of them are green and some of them are yellow. What happens is an inspector can go out and they can click on one of those blue boxes, and each of those blue boxes is a piece of property. And so we click on that box, and it will say, is it good or is it not? If it's not good, then it'll bring up the one on the far left. And so when we look at that far left one, what we see is a violation that's there. What this helps us to do is automatically generate a letter that will go to the homeowner of each of those different pieces of property, and they would then know what it is that they need to do to comply with the standards and make their homes and therefore their neighborhoods safer. When we go into that, we can actually click on a piece of property and we can ask for the information on the property, and that's what you see there in the center. Is it gives us what the property number is, the APN number, which is the assessor's number. And so we can look at it through that. We can look at it by the address, and it will tell us who the owner is, and we'll have to get owners' phone numbers and emails, but we've already got their addresses, and so we'll be able to send them a letter and say, hey, here's what's going on, and kind of go from there. So this is the piece that happens after we educate people. Once we educate people on what the ordinance says, and we do that as our educational campaign, then we begin the enforcement, and that will help us to reduce that overall risk. There is also an individual portal for individual property owners. When you get a letter from us, if you're in a zone that is designated as a high or a moderate zone at this point, that's where we think we're going to go with this. But when we send you a letter that says, hey, you're going to have to clear your property, and we'll tell you ahead of time that we're going to do these inspections, it will give you a PIN number, and you'll be able to log into this program to look at your property specifically. And you'll be able to see in real time whether or not we've inspected it or not, and if there are any violations or not. So that's actually a really nice piece here that will help us quite a bit. Once we've done the preparation and enforcement, then we go on to our next step, which is if a fire actually occurs. And so we'll go to the next slide, and we'll talk about the Zone Haven project. Once there's an event, we need to sometimes notify people very quickly of there being a problem. Zone Haven allows us to actually look at some of these things in a really cool way. We can, if you look at this map, you can see that there are some numbers all around. You'll see SM-E005, there's an E29 above that, there's an E091 to the left, and an E009 to the right, as well as there's a Bell E001 down below that. Here again, this is the Sugarloaf area that you see. You can see Laurelwood Park there, just kind of below and to the right of center. So I've highlighted a couple of zones in there, and what Zone Haven is telling me on the right-hand side is that there are roughly 2,200 people that live in that area, total of 978 structures, a total of 1,303 parcels, and a total area of 653 acres. And we can look at all of this stuff, and this is what we see on our side. So we can look at this and we can tell how many people are in what areas, and then make a decision on evacuations. Please move to the next slide. So when we do these, what can happen is we decide that an area needs to be evacuated. And so we'll pick a zone, and this is one of those two zones that you saw. And we can print these out and we can give them to our partners who handle the evacuation. And what you can see here is a couple of different things. You'll see some red dots on there, and those are things that allow us to be able to look at where choke points might be, and we can send police officers there to help mitigate traffic concerns at those particular zones if we need to. And then we also have some evacuation facilities that are on there, so if we wanted to tell somebody to evacuate to a school, those schools actually show on this map. And then arrival points are on here as well. And those are based on where we might want to evacuate somebody to. If we know that if you go one direction and there's a hazard in that direction, and we want you to be able to go to the other direction, then we can put that on these maps as well. And whoever is running the evacuation can then make sure that we are able to get people to those locations and tell them how to get to those locations. Next slide, please. One of the most interesting things about Zone Haven is that it gives us a scenario tool. And what you're looking at here is a simulated wildfire that occurs on a morning where we've got a 25-mile-an-hour east wind coming from the Diablo Range with 25% relative humidity and an 80-degree Fahrenheit temperature. And if we've got that kind of a fire, what you are looking at is how far that fire could spread in the immediate time frame, in 1 hour, in 3 hours, and 5 hours. So that orange, for example, that is a 3-hour burn time under those conditions. This has the ability to look at current weather conditions. So when we actually have an event, we can bring this up, we can run the simulation really quickly and tell how much of a problem we might be in if we don't get a handle on the fire. This helps us to make a determination on what we want to do for evacuations. And so it's a really powerful tool for us to be able to use that. We can then take those zones and click on the E005 zone and figure out how we're going to evacuate people. And this map would show us which directions we want to try and avoid running people through and which ways to actually get them out of danger. So it's a really powerful tool, and we're really thankful to have had that. The San Mateo County Fire Chiefs were the ones who initiated this project, but the project has transcended us and law enforcement and everybody in between who might have a hand in actually running an evacuation. One thing to note is that this is not the only way that we would communicate with you. If there is a problem, we are going to communicate in a bunch of different ways, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. Next slide, please. I kept mentioning the CAL FIRE map updates. So this is one of the things that I wanted to talk about tonight because it could have an effect on how our maps go. The state is working on their map updates. This is the current map. It was developed in 2008. And the state has always said, if you've got a very high fire hazard severity zone in your jurisdiction, you may choose to do certain things. So I brought this map up because it is in the jurisdiction. You're looking at a large portion of Water Dog Lake Park and Hidden Canyon just to the kind of south and east of that. And then the areas up around Polhemus Drive, north of Highway 92 up there in the upper left-hand corner. The thing to keep in mind is that because of the recent fires, the state has changed the laws around how these maps will work in the future. Please advance to the next slide. So the state adopted a new law called AB 38, and it changed portions of the health and safety code that change what happens if you are in a very high fire hazard severity zone, or either a very high or a high fire hazard severity zone. That's what the VHFHSZ stands for. And so what they did was they said that if you are going to purchase a home or sell a home, that there are going to be disclosures that tell you that you are in one of these zones. It will also require a statement of compliance that would be issued by us. And that statement of compliance would basically say that your property is either in compliance or out of compliance at the time of sale. And then the real estate agents could figure out what they're going to do from there. It will also require a notice of low-cost retrofits that I'll talk about in a little bit. And what you have to do on that particular disclosure is say whether or not there are any retrofits that exist on the home, and it will require that list of low-cost retrofits to be provided to the buyer. We are going to incorporate the low-cost retrofits into the fire code ordinance, and if people do a certain amount of work on their home, we may require them to actually do those low-cost retrofits. So more to come on that as we get into actual development of the ordinance. Those low-cost retrofits, if you would like to take a look at them, are here. Again, we'll post this on our website, but a really great website is readyforwildfire.org. If you go there, you can navigate through that website, and that list is pretty prominently displayed on how you can prepare side of things. Some of the things, though, that we look for in the low-cost retrofits is if you're going to replace the roof on your home, it has to be replaced with fire retardant material. So if you're using cedar shakes currently, you'd have to go to what we call a Class A roof, which is more of an asphalt shingle that has a better amount of fire resistance. It talks about what decks can be made out of. It talks about the vents in your eaves and how you can protect those vents. And a lot of these things are actually relatively inexpensive. The most expensive one on there is probably the roofing. Anybody who's replaced a roof recently probably scoffed at as soon as I said, oh yeah, low cost retrofit, it's a roof. And that one is the most expensive one. But the good news is we don't have a lot of roofs that don't comply already. And so that's probably not that big of an issue for most people. So those are the low-cost retrofits. So what is it that you can do to help? And this is probably one of the more important things of the presentation. So the first thing is to give yourself defensible space, and we'll talk about what that means here in just a moment. The next thing is to have an emergency plan. And then the last thing is to stay informed. So when we say give yourself defensible space, what is it that we mean? Next slide. So defensible space is the practice of making sure that the stuff closest to your home is the least flammable as possible. And then a little bit further out in what we call zone 2, there are things that you can do that will reduce the intensity of a fire as it approaches the structure. Next slide. So in zone 1, which basically is everything up to about 30 feet away from your home, we would ask you to do all of these things, which is removing your dead plants, grass and weeds, removing dead and dry leaves and pine needles from your yard, your roof, and your rain gutters. Your roof and your rain gutters is really, really important. Even if you're not in a wildland area, it's very, very important that you clear those out. I've seen, and all of us on the panel here have seen where leaf accumulation in rain gutters and in the valleys of your roof can take embers and they'll start to burn right there on the roof. I know I've been to a couple fires where it was just a structure fire. It wasn't even a vegetation fire, but because of the debris in the gutters and on the roof, it spread to the additional structures. So that's a really, really important one. Branches that hang over your roof, you need to be careful of and keep 10 feet away from your chimney. If you have dead branches, they should be removed altogether. If you keep your trees trimmed, just keep them 10 feet from other trees if you can. The crowns are going to be fine against one another, but you don't want too many trees in too close of succession. If you have a wood burning fireplace and you have a wood pile near your house, you should relocate that. You should remove or prune flammable plants and shrubs that are near your windows. That's one of the big ways that fire spreads into a home is through your windows. Removing vegetation and items that could catch fire from around and under decks, that's particularly important if you live on a hillside. And then create a separation between the trees, shrubs, and items that could catch fire, such as patio furniture, wood piles, swing sets. You might consider what you have near a fence, and how close your deck might be to a fence and all of those kinds of things. So these are all the things that we look for in the zone 1 of your defensible space. On the next slide, we have zone 2. So in zone 2, the things that we're looking for are cutting or mowing of annual grass to about 4 inches, create a horizontal space between shrubs and trees, and you can see that in that diagram on that first slide of this series. Creating vertical space between grass, shrubs, and trees, and removing fallen leaves, tree needles, twigs, bark, cones, and small branches, anything more than 3 inches deep. These two things combined eliminate what we in our business call ladder fuels. And if you go to the Ready for Wildfire website, you can actually see a really good illustration of what that actually looks like. But a ladder fuel basically is, if you think about a campfire, when you're going to build a campfire or a fire in a fireplace, you can't just throw a log in there, light it on fire, and hope that it's going to do anything. What you do is you put some twigs and maybe some pine needles down first. And then you get a little bit bigger twigs and you put those on top of that. And then on top of that, you put some small diameter branches in there. And then on top of that, you put some bigger branches. And then finally, you put the bigger log on there. If you light that on fire, and you might start that with a piece of newspaper or some other kind of crumpled up paper, when you do that, the fire spreads from the lightest amount of fuel that you have into the heaviest amount of fuel, because it takes a lot of energy to get a big piece of fuel to burn. Well, in the defensible space zones, it's no different. If you don't create that defensible space, what you've done is you've assembled the kindling, you've assembled the medium fuels, you've assembled the large fuels, and you've set the stage for a bigger fire that will burn for a long time. So if you can remove all of the kindling from your property, that will help you to make sure that you don't have a problem in the long term. Next slide, please. So that's the first thing, is to prepare for it. The next thing is to have a plan. And a plan is great because it works for all kinds of an emergency. We have the San Andreas Fault that's just west of the jurisdiction. We've got wildfires that could occur. We have severe weather events that happen every few years, either high wind events or high rain events or both. We could have localized flooding. An emergency plan will work for any of those emergencies if you put the thought into it. There's a few components to an emergency plan. So the first thing is an evacuation plan. Where are you going to go if something does happen? And another important component to this is a communication plan, having somebody who's out of the area that you and your family can call if you're separated. Sometimes phone lines don't work in an area, particularly in the case of a wildfire or a large power outage. It could be that the cell phone towers that are closest to you are not going to work. So once you get a signal, you can call somebody out of the area and they will be able to take your call and be able to tell the other people that call whether or not they've heard from your son or your daughter or your grandmother or your wife or your husband or what have you. So those are some things to keep in mind. Having emergency supplies ready is also very important. Have an emergency supply kit. Make sure that you have things like water, your medications, some of your important documents. These are all important things to have in your kit. Again, if you go to readyforwildfire.org, there are a lot of great tips there for you to be able to find out what you might need. We also have those tips on our website that we'll give you a little bit later as well. Another important thing is get out early if you can. When it's time to go, you need to go. Don't wait for an evacuation to be told when to go. But if you can get out early, it's much safer to do that. You've probably all seen pictures of what it looks like in Paradise when they were trying to evacuate in the conditions that they were confronted with. While I don't believe that we would have as severe of conditions as you saw in Paradise, because most of our vegetation is not that big, it's still quite scary. I can tell you that having driven through fires on fire apparatus, that it gives you some pause, even if you're used to seeing it. So if you're not used to seeing it and you haven't felt the heat that a fire generates and the visibility that drops because of the smoke and the fire that's around you, it is quite scary. So getting out early before you get those conditions is always the best thing that you can possibly do. So again, get out early if you can and evacuate once you're told to evacuate. Make sure that you don't delay and you actually get out. That's very, very important for a lot of different reasons. So participating is really good. One of the things that we have found as just emergency managers in general is that people tend not to believe one single message when they hear it. They need it from multiple sources. And so there are a lot of different ways that you can get alerted. The Zone Haven project that we mentioned earlier, one of the ways that we will alert you is through the SMC alert system. And so we've got a link up here for SMC alert. If you are not a part of SMC alert and you would like to become a part of SMC alert, the QR code that you see there on the screen will actually take you directly to the website. So if you hold your phone up to that, I know it works on iPhone, I think it works on Android as well. You can just hold your camera up to that and it'll ask you if you want to open that website. And so you can go there and sign up right now while we're still on this Zoom meeting. Getting involved in CERT is another thing that you could do. CERT is the Community Emergency Response Teams. We have a CERT program here and we are working diligently to be able to offer CERT virtually on all those aspects that we can do it virtually. There are still some things that you actually have to do in person to get the full experience, but we are working on ways of making sure that those are as safe as possible. The other thing that we really like to encourage people to do is talk to your neighbors. Make sure that you know where your neighbors are at, what kinds of challenges they might have, because we rely on people to tell us, my next door neighbor has a mobility issue and they might need help getting out. We depend on those kinds of things. The other thing is that your neighbor's ability to take care of their weeds and their vegetation is related to your safety, just as your ability to take care of weeds and vegetation is related to their safety. If we can do this all as a team, then we wind up with a much safer community. FireWise, I mentioned earlier, is a program offered by the National Fire Protection Association that empowers communities to make decisions on how they are going to best protect themselves. And so we're going to facilitate FireWise communities throughout the jurisdiction. But if you wanted to get a head start about what FireWise actually is, you can go to www.nfpa.org/FireWise and read all about the program. So I want to turn it over now to Chief Thrasher for a minute. I would like for him, he is our Deputy Chief of Operations, and he can tell you about how responses work and how they will respond during COVID, and then talk a little bit about evacuations. So Chief Thrasher, it's all yours.
Thank you, Fire Marshal Marshall, and thanks for the great presentation and all the work you put into this. So thank you for having me, folks. I am the Deputy Fire Chief of Operations for San Mateo Consolidated Fire Department, and I get the pleasure of keeping an eye on and keeping ready to go the 126 men and women that we have on the front lines in our fire engines and ladder trucks out there on a day-to-day basis, taking care of our community. So let me talk first about our response and what our responses look like. During the pandemic and the COVID crisis that we're experiencing, there are many changes for us as to how our day-to-day activities around the fire stations are working, and what the equipment we're wearing, what PPE we're using, how we're doing the different things that we have always done. But one thing that's not changing is the fact that if you need us, we're there. So that has not changed a bit, and that will not change if there's anything we can do to keep that from happening. In a wildfire situation, the response the model that you get will look just like it did before COVID. How we treat things afterwards, how we clean up, how we social distance in our large briefings and things like that will change for us. And there may be some more changes down the road, but the response that is given to the community should not change. If there's a problem, we'll show up and we'll do everything we can to get it taken care of. The response locally, we're in a very good situation in our county, in that our county functions very much like one large singular fire department. We have a single dispatch system that runs out of Redwood City that dispatches all the fire apparatus throughout the entire county. So they dispatch us, and we are able to use the resources from throughout this county as though we're one department. And in fact, we have a philosophy that we go by. It says no boundaries. So there are no boundaries in our communities here. If a fire engine from Belmont happens to be driving through Burlingame, going to a training up in South San Francisco, and a call comes in Burlingame that they happen to be the closest to, they're going to respond to that because there are no boundaries and they're the closest. And likewise, that's the way it would happen here in our communities in Belmont, San Mateo, and Foster City. So because we have that model, it's very easy for us to have any type of a situation grow in response. So let's take a typical situation for vegetation issues like we're talking about today. If we had a vegetation fire in February, it's going to be much different than if we had a vegetation fire in August or September. So in February, that response may be a single fire engine to go to the location of where the report came in, and they would either take care of the fire, and during February, a single engine can take care of most vegetation issues. Or if it was larger, they would request resources, and those resources would come from the closest available resources, be that from within our own department, our own jurisdictions, or further out. If they happen to be on the border of, say, San Mateo on the north side, then the next responding units might be from Burlingame and Central County Fire. It's whoever's closest in this county. Now, as we move into the summer months and things change for us in an environmental condition, and we look at things like the temperature, we look at weather, we look at burn rates and lots of science that is very deep as to how things are going to react to any type of a fire. We look at the wind. All those things are put into calculations, And on an ongoing basis, we are evaluating what the current situation is within our jurisdictions. So CAL FIRE, the state fire department, oversees a process by which they take measurements from weather stations throughout the state. And in our area, I believe we have 15 or 16 of those monitoring sites throughout our county. They take those reports on a daily basis and several times throughout the day, depending on the time of the year, and they establish what level of response we're at. So like right now, we're at a low response level. And so we get a typical response for vegetation fire during this time of the year would be low. It would be 1 to 2 or 3 pieces of equipment that would go out and try to take care of the problem. And if they need help, they would get help. Now, as those models changes, as we get continuous weather like we've had the last few days, where the temperatures are very high, where the humidity level begins to drop, and where the winds start to pick up, then that level is going to change. It would go to a medium or to a high level of dispatch. And our county dispatch system that I mentioned earlier takes into account what level we're at and dispatches the appropriate resources. So a dispatch at a low level, you may get 1 to maybe 2 or 3 pieces of equipment show up. At a high level dispatch, we're going to get multiple pieces of equipment, including bulldozers from CAL FIRE, including helicopters and aircraft, all on the way automatically for a vegetation event when we're at a high dispatch level. So the cavalry's coming, and it's going to be sized based on the incident and based on the weather in a given situation. So I just want you all to know that we evaluate that stuff continuously, and we evaluate it more often as the conditions worsen. So when we get into August, September, October, those really hot days where we've had many, many days of low humidity, high winds, you start seeing things like a red flag day. Those are typically going to be when we're at our highest dispatch level. The response model is going to be appropriate to handle the given situation, given that particular response, given the current environmental conditions. So it's a lot I covered right there, but I just wanted to let you know that the response model grows dependent on what the environmental conditions are that we're currently in. And if we happen to get beyond that, which, I'd look to the panel for anybody with any input, but I don't recall having to have a mutual aid brought into our county in my career here. The last time I remember something like that happening, and I wasn't even on board at that point, was the Oakland Hills fire, and that was out of our county, but it was probably the closest. Next to that would be the issues we've had in Santa Rosa and up at the campfire. But because of our topography, because of our weather conditions, because of the prevailing moisture that we get from the coast side, it's difficult for us to get in those situations where we have those large types of fires that we're starting to see more and more of. So if that were to happen, though, we have a state mutual aid system that is similar to what I just described for you within our own county, but it's on a state basis. Our local folks reach out to the region, and the region reaches out to the state, and they start requesting resources that are needed from outside of our area to respond into our area to help us out if we get to that point. There are several times throughout the year, like the campfire that we spoke of, the fires up in Redding, there's ones in Santa Rosa, where we send our resources out from this county to go help them fight those big fires up there. And we do that in response to that state mutual aid system and a request that we got in our county to send out our resources to help out. Now, we do that without depleting our resources here locally. Our folks go, and they go out for usually 14 to 21 days at a time, and they're battling those fires, and the remaining crews stay here at home and take care of business here within our own towns. So that's kind of how the mutual aid system works, how our response models work within our county. So I know it's a big topic out there. I know it can be a little bit confusing. There's a lot of information about it out on our website. And if you have any questions here tonight, feel free to enter some questions into the Q&A box. Now, when it comes to evacuations, let's keep in mind evacuations, as Fire Marshal Marshall mentioned earlier, that the best way to handle an evacuation is to always be prepared, and be prepared to take care of yourself, and be prepared to do it early. You don't need to wait for somebody to pound on your door to tell you to leave when there's a fire bearing down on you. If you can make that decision yourself and get out, then you're going to be better off. So it's always better to have a plan and take care of yourself whenever possible. Evacuations themselves, legally it's a function of law enforcement. So we use our law enforcement partners to help us out with that quite a bit. And Fire Marshal Marshall went over several of the tools that we have and will have at our disposal to help us as the experts on the firefighting side decide that, you know, based on this fire that is just started down in this part of town, and the wind direction and the humidity levels and all the other factors that we weigh into those things, we think the fire's going to head this direction at this speed, and we need to evacuate these people that are in these quadrants. And we have tools now that really help us with identifying that. And we'll work with our law enforcement partners to tell them, here's what we need evacuated, and we need it done by this time. They will work with other groups, along with our Office of Emergency Services and the county resources, to start facilitating that. Now, that evacuation notice can come to you in many forms. Those forms could be as simple as a police officer knocking on your door telling you, hey, there's a fire heading this way, it's time for you to go. It could be a phone call from a reverse 911 system that is currently in place. It could be something like SMC Alert. SMC Alert, which Fire Marshal Marshall just talked about, would send out a cell or a text or a page to everybody that's in the area that needs to go and advise you of the evacuation. So, you know, it could be a police car or even a fire engine driving up and down the street with a PA system letting people know it's time to go. So there are many ways and many forms that an evacuation request can take place. The key for us is that we have the tools to identify what areas are going to need to be evacuated based on the situation that we have in front of us. So again, a lot of information there. It's very complex, but again, the core of all this is do whatever you can to take care of yourself and be prepared. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Fire Marshal Marshall.
Thank you very much, Chief. So we've reached the end of the presentation. We do have some time available for questions if anybody has any. We don't see any questions in there yet, but we'll leave it open here for a couple minutes. And if you have a question, feel free to type it in, and we will do our best to answer it. In the meantime, we thank you very much for joining us. We hope that this has been informative. And again, we will post this to our website. We have recorded it, so we will post it, and you will be able to take a look at it at any time if you have any questions. If you do have any further questions, you can reach us on our website. Our website is www.smcfire.org, and we will handle that. So looks like we do have one question, and Mr. McCune, thank you for that. You missed the first part. So it'll be posted, I hope, tomorrow. If not tomorrow, we'll have it posted by Monday for sure. So thank you. Drew, you look like you have some questions for us, so go ahead and ask away. So Drew is typing his questions. So Drew's first question is, how do embers figure into the maps, like a secondary fire risk in the lowlands? So yeah, that's a great question, actually. So when we did the mapping, and we used a model that was generated by the federal government, the National Wildfire Coordination Group. And they have a series of criteria in there about fuel types. And when they develop those fuel types, let's just say take a fuel type of a eucalyptus tree, because everybody knows that those burn pretty well. So when they program that into the risk assessment, one of the things that the risk assessment does is take into consideration what kind of embers might be generated from that particular fuel type. So things like oily trees, things like eucalyptus, acacia, and then even smaller plants like Scotch broom in windy conditions put off a lot of embers, and the fuel model actually takes that into consideration. So that's how it gets figured in. When the model looks at the fires, it also takes into consider weather. So it will look at what a weather event might be, and it kind of takes an average of what the weather is during the peak fire season and looks at that, which also has to do with ember generation. And so every time you look at that map, you can rest assured that it actually does take into consideration embers. When you type in your address into that map, one of the things it will tell you is it might tell you that you're in a smoke risk zone or that you're in a low hazard zone. And those generally are things that are from ember generation. So that is what that is. So I hope that answers your question on that. Do you have any other questions, or anybody else on the line have any questions for us?
Fire Marshal Marshall, if I may, I wanted to point out something that
Sure.
is kind of exciting news for all of us here. We are in the process of receiving a couple of small fire engines from the state. The state will give us these fire engines to use in our own jurisdictions as we need to. And in response to that, the give for the state is that we will then staff them and send them out as requested to help with large mutual aid fires throughout the state when needed. These are called Type 6 fire engines. I know a couple of our council meetings, they've been mentioned. They're like large pickup trucks, kind of pickup trucks on steroids. They have a few hundred gallons of water mounted on them. They have a complement of fire hose and some equipment, and a crew can get those in their four-wheel drive. A crew can get those into some very remote areas, like, up into the Sugarloaf, or, down around Water Dog, and some other areas that we haven't typically been able to get that type of equipment into, to help maybe knock down a small fire before it gets too large. So we're really excited about that. We anticipate receiving those sometime this fall and have them up and running, and our staff fully trained on them for the next wildland season. But we do anticipate seeing them, and once we get them, I'm sure the councils will be made aware, and there'll be some presentations there. I just wanted to bring that one up. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. Appreciate the input. And yeah, we are very excited to have those Type 6s coming. One other question here from Drew. He says that the prototype of zones around a house here seems not typical to too many homes because there are much tighter property lines. For example, a property line might be 5 or 10 feet away, not the width of the zones shown. Could a typical property be shown for these situations? So yes, we will be talking about that when we do our educational campaign. We'll talk about what it means for people when you have those shorter areas. The zones themselves, though, they actually remain the same. It's what can you do on your property to contribute to that, and then hopefully what will happen is everybody else will take care of their properties as well. That gives us those that total clearance. The thing about those clearances is those clearances are the things that we know that make structures safer. Fire doesn't really depend on property lines. It doesn't say, oh, okay, I've reached this property line, I have to change how I'm burning because I'm burning across this property line. It doesn't know any different. It just burns and burns and burns. And so the zones actually don't really change. What we'll do, though, is we'll tell people how you can take care of the stuff in your zone. And if you live against an open space, we will talk about and address what things you might be able to do particularly if you're up against public land, the things that you might be able to do to help make your structure safer, as well as what the cities and the open space owners will be doing to do their part as well. So great question. The other question, another question that we have here is the Zone Haven. Is it based on APN info? Because some people have many sheds and that kind of stuff. So Zone Haven looks at an entire population of an area, and so we can look at that and look at how many people are in the area, and the decisions are made based on that. So that is how the Zone Haven project works. It doesn't particularly rely on the number of structures per se, like if there are sheds and that kind of thing, it doesn't really take that into consideration. Right now, we're still entering information into Zone Haven as well. So we use things like property records, and one of the things that we get off of the property records are if there are things on a property like accessory dwelling units or junior accessory dwelling units, or ADUs as they're called. So we look at those things, and that does factor into how much is how many people are in those areas and that kind of thing. So those numbers will be constantly changing as we do new construction. We'll enter in the new structures there, and we'll keep that updated as much as we possibly can, because the better the data is in those areas, the more robust our efforts can be as far as making sure that we have appropriate evacuation zones. So any other questions? On the 3DI software, those yellow and green colors, we got a question about the maps on those on the 3DI software. They're determined, that's basically determines whether or not they've been inspected or not. When you look at the green color there, that's something that we'll only see on our side. I don't think you'll see that on your side. But what it would do is if we see green, we know that the property complies with the vegetation standards. If we see yellow, we know there are violations that need to be addressed. And then as they abate their violations, then we would click on it and it would change to green, and we would be all good from there. All right. So another question, does Chapter 7A have retrofit info? Not exactly. It tells you what you have to do in there. The retrofit information will be placed into our ordinance and placed on our website about what would happen there. The Chapter 7A is basically telling us on the code world side how it needs to be built, and if you hire an architect, your architect would know what a lot of those things mean. We'd be happy to answer questions if you do that stuff and you need specific guidance. We'd be happy to do that. So that looks like it might be the last question. If anybody has any further questions, again, feel free to reach out to us at our website, www.smcfire.org. And excuse me. We will answer those questions. I did get another question that popped up real quick. The website info where you'll be able to enter your address to see the fire danger on your property. We don't have that posted yet. We're hoping to get that posted in August or so. If you do have a question about your specific property, you can contact me via the website though, and I can give you an idea about what your particular danger might be in your general area. So. Well, thank you again, everybody. We appreciate you attending this evening. We know that being online all day is taxing and challenging, and we truly appreciate your attention. Again, this will be posted later on our website, and if you, again, have any questions for any of us, feel free to reach out to us, and we will answer the questions as best as we can. All right. Thank you so much. And we will talk to you all later. Thanks again for attending.